Okay, this week is brought to you by Mercury. It's in the Monday will be the final day of its out of bounds dance, and will also be the day that it goes into its retrograde motion. I'm going to start out and read you the first paragraph from Michael Mead's uh, post from today called "Genuine and Undivided." And if you really tune into what it is that Mercury is about, it has two sides, you know. Is it a divided side or is it an undivided side? Here's what he writes. At the human level, when faced with a great obstacle or a true dilemma, there will be one of two outcomes. Either we become bigger people who understand ourselves in the world better, or we will become smaller souls, more narrow in our thinking, and ultimately more rejecting of the mystery and wonder of life. We may feel overwhelmed by fear and anxiety as the tension in life becomes greater and problems seem to grow in size as time runs out. But what life wants is meaningful change. Either we face the way that life roars at us and become wiser and more of a friend of the world, or else we run in fear and shrink from life, mystery, and love. To also bring into our consideration the out of bounds factor, because on Monday, the moon, which has been out of bounds since the 6th, Mercury's been out of bounds since the 1st, and Pluto's been out of bounds for a while and will be out of bounds till the end of the month. What exactly is out of bounds? It's besides being a mathematical aspect of latitude, because the planets, mm, they move up and down in relationship to the Earth's tilt. And we have an equator runs around our planet, and we have the Tropic of Cancer up in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn down in the south. And these are sitting at 23 degrees, 26 minutes on either side of that equator. And if you expand out into the greater surround of this solar system that we are in, the planets essentially spend most of their time within that 23 degrees 26 south and 23 26 north, the two tropics. However, every once in a while, the planets wander. Yeah, they're called wandering lights. And in that latitude, up and down, and they're wandering, besides their, orbital wandering that they're doing around the sun, when they get beyond, and some of them can get beyond that 23, 26 degrees north or south of the ecliptic, they're said to be out of bounds. So on Monday, Mercury's going to come back in bounds. The moon is going to come back in bounds, but they're still out of bounds here on this Sunday as I'm recording this. When a planet is out of bounds, it basically it reaches an attitude in which, because the sun and Saturn, the two, planets of control and restriction theoretically, uh, they don't ever go out of bounds. But when another planet goes beyond that boundary line, it's said to, basically get to that point where, you know, the solar uh, incentive to do and to be such and such, it's okay up to a point. And Saturn, Saturn, the planet of limitations and restrictions, has, it's set in motion a consideration that says, you know, if you want to be successful in this life dance, stay within the constraints of what it is that I have marked out for you as something obligatory, something that is, acceptable. A planet out of bounds says, acceptable to who? And constrained by what? When I go out of bounds, it's kind of like I I can take a deeper breath. I can breathe out more. I'm not constrained to act in this way or that way by somebody else's dictates. Some of the key words for out of bounds are unrestrained, extreme, independent. I'm not dependent on what somebody says I need to do. Wild, I've been, essentially released from somebody else's dictates to say that this and this and this need to happen in this fashion and that fashion. No, no, no. I'm, I'm, I'm beyond those bounds. I'm out of bounds. Can be kind of an awkward quality to this because, you know, things have been moving along, oh, splendidly, so well within the constraints of what has been determined as acceptable. So, could there be discomfort? Possibly. It depends on your mileage with whatever these planets that do go out of bounds have in your natal chart. So, you could say that there might be some vulnerability here, Do I trust the capacity of what that particular planet that is out of bounds now, Mercury, we're talking, how we think, how we communicate in Sagittarius, which is, basically an unlimited frontier. Do we sense that, you know, we could be stepping beyond the borders of not only what is acceptable here in this life dance that we're doing, but could it maybe be that we're biting off more than we can chew? Can you feel the potential for vulnerability in that? At the same time, you know, just having the awareness of that kind of access to something more than is considered appropriate could actually lead to the presentation of kind of a privileged attitude, you know. And we're talking Mercury, how we think and how we speak in the sign of Sagittarius, that really is about what more is there, Do you sense that possibly a privilege might be there for us to tune into in what it is that we're becoming aware of? I don't just wander within the realms of astrology. I think anybody in the living experience, if we're trying to constrain ourselves within particular border lines that say, you know, I can only really be acceptable if I stick to a certain archetypal life dance process that certain music plays and I need to move in certain directions. And I'm an Aquarius. And that kind of constraint really, it doesn't, it just doesn't always sit that comfortably for me. So I've been following a shamanic path for a lot of years. There's a particular uh, version of the shamanic dance presented through Alberto Villoldo and his wife Marcella. And years ago, I was at a shamanic workshop with Hank Wesselman, who, rest in peace, is no longer with us anymore. And the group had gathered around this table and they were playing with this deck of cards. And I kind of sat down to see, hey, what's going on here? Always curious. Um, and it turned out to be a mystical shaman oracle deck put together with the cooperation from Alberto Violdo and Marcella and an artist who, you know, was getting images for different, you know, energy signatures. So I drew a card this morning to see, what is it that is about? This is the card. The card is wind. Can you feel the potential for a vibrational pulse coming from a particular direction? In this moment for you that, you know, has a bearing on where you are being forced. Am I going to follow the wind? Am I going to go into the wind? According to Alberto and his lineage, a south wind carries a new sense of trust, helping you gently to begin and discard habits and parts of you that are no longer needed. If you feel a west wind calling you, this is an invitation to more introspection, to a willingness to make final decisions, to let go of attachment and ego desires. If it's a north wind that you feel pulling you, pushing you, you might be moving to bring wisdom and strength into your space. If it should be an east wind, possibly it could be carrying a clarity of vision and purpose. Whichever way the wind is blowing. For you, the message which the wind whispers or shouts is a challenge. It may take courage at first to turn and face the wind, but you will find exaltation in moving toward it and receiving its lessons. I may have mentioned this a time or two before. The astrological vehicle that I tuned into back in the late 60s has kind of always been there, kind of like one of those winds that that card was talking about, sometimes seeming to want to push me in the direction of discovering more. And I would almost be inclined to say that that more aspect, which is Mercury in Sagittarius right now, is bringing for my consideration, has been kind of like a repeating pattern throughout this investigation of life dance that I was born into, that I was always sensed, you know, what else is there? The midheaven in a chart, that point that's straight overhead, is often defined as one's mission in life. You know, there's a driving calling, if you were, to embody, embrace what it is that that particular sign that's on that midheaven for you says that if you tune into this vibrational space effectively enough, something might just click, an awakening to uh, the living dance in a fashion that is an expression of that particular zodiacal sign. I was born in a time and a place where Sagittarius was on my midheaven, you know, that calling for what else is there? What more is there? And recognizing that from a Sagittarian perspective, there are no limits. So this Mercury out of bounds dance that has been going on since the 1st of November in Sagittarius. Well, yeah, in Sagittarius, because it may have been right at the end of Scorpio then. But it's Advent into the sign of Sagittarius, you know, it starts my blood percolating in ways that, you know, might not necessarily be so predictable. So, as would be in any particular avenue chosen to be followed for myself, my sensing currently is that there are other avenues, other ways to feel into the interpretation of how this life dance could unfold if I willingly, you know, took the time to investigate options that there are many to choose from land on my plate, often through synchronicity in ways that I couldn't anticipate. And I have lived my whole life with that very same perspective that I often will arrive in a moment that I really don't have a clear understanding of what next is going to tug on a part of me to pull me in a particular direction. Let's take a look at the chart. This is Monday, and you will notice that first we'll go up here to our latitude thing, our declinations, and you'll see that the moon is still out of bounds. It's red. It's beyond that 23, 26. Mercury, something we're focusing on here today, is still out of bounds, 2337. And Pluto is out of bounds, 2329. Um, this is the last day for the moon and for Mercury. Pluto is going to be hanging in its out of bounds thing through the rest of the month. Back to our chart. On this day as well, Mercury turns retrograde as Sunday today turns into tomorrow, Monday. Mercury will station at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. Uh, it has been, let's just take a quick look. If we just go back a day at a time, you can kind of see there. Wednesday of last week, it shifted from 5 degrees into 6 degrees and will stay at 6 degrees even when it's retrograde until Thursday of this week. So it goes retrograde there at 6 degrees. And you say, well, Mercury goes retrograde, 3 times a year. Sometimes in a rare year, it might be even 4 times. And usually that's when you'll get that overlap of it being retrograde already at the beginning of the year, or it'll go into the end of the year and it'll carry on its retrograde dance into the next. Every time that Mercury goes retrograde, you have to ask yourself, you know, am I being clear with what it is that I'm thinking or that I am saying that I can effectively communicate with others in a manner wherein we might be able to attain a version of being on the same page? That, my friends, is the Mercury retrograde challenge. It's not unheard of to be in one of those retrograde Mercury cycles and find yourself in a conversation with somebody. And, you know, you're doing your darndest, you know, to keep up with what it is that they're saying. And yet at the same time, there's this jibber jabber kind of stuff going on in your brain, and you're having a hard time bringing your focus into what it is that the other person is saying because, so many firing off points are in that other's expression that send your mind off on tangential trajectories to who knows where. Welcome to Mercury retrograde. And in the conversational space that we find ourselves with each other in what? Sagittarian fashion. So, can you feel the potential for expansion into realms that you have not been in before, as trying to get you to pay attention to a larger perspective than you ever thought possible? And yet at the same time, it's Mercury retrograde. Is there clarity in what it is that is this larger potential? It's going to take work. So, in any Mercury cycle, the ideal way to utilize that mercurial energy is to investigate, dig deeper into the energy of what Mercury is asking you in those moments. Now, you say, yeah, right. My thinking processes right now, you know, they're a little bit clouded. They're the ability to facilitate clarity. It comes with a caveat, you know. Personal clarity is one thing. A clarity that you can share with others, that's a whole different ballgame. Doesn't necessarily need to be, but in Mercury retrograde cycle, it is often the case. And since, this is a Sagittarian consideration, you know, the potential for the avenues of exploration to, reach out, be more, expand more, think more, wander into realms that you hadn't wandered into before is in the mix. Oftentimes, prior to a Mercury retrograde cycle, if you're working on something, it is highly, highly advisable to, to gather resources around you to utilize during the Mercury retrograde cycle as an exploration or a refinement of what it is that is intriguing you in the moment. The key is always to try to gather this information before Mercury goes retrograde. I hinted at this last week. And so if there's something that you are really into now, this is an ideal time to, hit the books. Utilize the energy of, you know, change that is always in place when Mercury's involved to uh, be available to discover something new. Now, another caveat to any Mercury retrograde cycle is that it's not just you where the unclarity bug is functioning. It is, uh, it's afoot. And so if, you know, you happen to be in a cycle whereby you are required to facilitate something that is, you know, has, it carries merit, like a contract or an appointment for certain things that really need to transpire, it is very, very advisable to make sure you are clear on what it is that is transpiring because the potential for unclarity to be in the mix of what is going on, you know, pay attention. If you happen to, be in a contractual space that needs to be, you know, facilitated in some fashion, be very cautious of signing on the bottom line until you really understand what it is that has been written on that particular document. Have you read the small print? Often overlooked. And during any Mercury retrograde cycle, that our capacity to, hone in and focus and pay attention on those details is challenged. Which way is your wind blowing? And are you flowing with it or are you heading into it? It does make a difference. Now, this particular degree where Mercury goes retrograde, where it's Mercury is basically was traveling direct and is all of a sudden going to be going retrograde. Let's look at the Sabian symbol. For things to meditate upon, Sabian symbols can be used as a divinatory tool, but you have to be willing and capable of kind of like reading between the lines as to what is being offered for consideration by this Sabian symbol in relation to the particular planetary vibration that is in the mix. So, what are we thinking about? What do you want to say? The Sabian symbol reads Cupid knocks at the door of a human heart. Feel that. Feel the heart in that. The keynote, a stirring up of individual longings for romantic love. Venus, that's what we're talking about here. Venus just entered into Scorpio last week on the 6th. I don't want to dwell on that, but the potential for intimate connectivity at a very interpersonal level is on the table when when Venus is doing its dance through that sign of Scorpio. There are mysteries afoot. There's you know, a potential for secretiveness that is also flowing within these waves of this water sign that wants to, feel things that it hasn't felt before. Back to our Sabian symbol. In contrast to the preceding, which read a game of cricket with the keynote, the development of skill in group situations testing collective goals. That's the previous symbol. Anyway, in this symbol, where Cupid is knocking at the door, it refers to what one might call a personal initiation through an ideal love, Far from being related to social value, ideal love tends to exalt individual characteristics in that it glorifies what seems to be able to fill poignant and often unconscious needs. Such a love is a projection of the anima or animus, images which, in a sense, complement the outer character of the one who loves. It is a subjective event which tends to bring to the lover a crisis or emotional chaos. Such a love often turns asocial, if not antisocial, and is blocked or frowned upon by society. The invitation is for you to find that central point within yourself, to always make sure that in this love quest, which is being essentially, you know, ignited by Venus's presence in Scorpio now, to uh, to tap into a soul level of awareness and interconnection with another, to investigate, you know, mysteries that often tickle the edges of, you know, secret spaces that we have developed within ourselves in the experience of being alive that, you know, often surface when we get that close and intimate with another. The key is trust. Trust in oneself enough to recognize the potential advantages that that close proximity with another is going to birth as the potentially inclusive or not larger container within which this connectivity is developing. That's not all the things happening this week. We go to Tuesday. Notice Mars and Mercury. They're a degree apart. When we go to Wednesday, they're less than a degree apart. So you can kind of see this Mars energy. Mars is a it's kind of a challenge to drawing things together because Mars's energy is it's the warrior, and in a sense, there's a there are hard edges to what it is that Mars represents. It because Mars wants to break things apart. You know, it's that kind of driven uh, intensity to to find the weaknesses in any circumstance and bring focus to them. You know, create this harmony, if you will. And so we have this Mars coming into a very close proximity with that retrograde Mercury now. You might sense, you know, a certain tension that comes into play as you go through this Mercury retrograde cycle this week. And uh, I could almost picture, you know, I've made this determination of an area I want to further look into. Mars coming into conjunction with that Mercury is going to, you know, it's going to like possibly put up little prickly blockades in the way that says, no, 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 I'm not going to allow you to do that. because there's something else I want to distract you with. You know, my Martian, Sagittarian energy says there's so much more that can, draw your energy this way and that way and every which way, but the area that you really want to focus on, that is one of the potentials. They're going to meet at that sixth, fifth degree of Sagittarius. This will be in the mix of that seeking for that ideal love connection as a possibility of, spawning what might take place in that interactive field. Allow it to sit there. Don't dwell on it too much. Just be aware that there are other factors afoot that may, challenge the very idea of actually engaging at that level with another. And on this same day, the moon, no longer out of bounds, is going to move into its final quarter moon with the sun. Crisis in consciousness. Feel, if you will, you know, what version of potential interaction intimately with another is going to cause your uh, mental acuity to wonder quite specifically if this is an appropriate direction to follow. Crisis in consciousness. This doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be overtly on board, in your face, in the potential interaction spaces that you engage with others in. It's there, it's the moon, it's your feeling. And the moon is in Leo, the sun is in Scorpio. You know, there is a definite intensity that's there that the moon in Leo is like, I want to gamble. I want to take chances. You can kind of almost feel discomfort in trying to sit in a space and not change into what? With what? With how you engage in that interplay space with another. And Scorpio, oh, Scorpio saying, come, play with me. Because there's, you know, the potential for levels of intimacy that we engage with each other that, you know, we don't know where it's going to go. It's going to challenge us. It might be more playful than we'd anticipated. Can you feel that, crisis in consciousness at work there? And, nothing exists in a bubble without. This is where, when I sit here to try and consider a week's astrology, it's just kind of like, well, someone who is of a particular sign with a particular astrological planetary makeup is going to engage in this in a way that is appropriate for them. So generally, when I'm looking at it, I'm just looking at, what signs are the planets in, not what houses are in, not what arenas of a person's life this might be unfolding in. But Jupiter at 25 degrees of Cancer, where it is, by the way, going to turn retrograde, you know, actually very shortly, on Wednesday this week, is in a nice trine over there to Saturn. It's not an exact trine and it doesn't become an exact trine because Jupiter is indeed going to turn retrograde. See that? It just turned red. So on Wednesday, as Tuesday became Wednesday, Jupiter said, you know, in my adventure of really engaging with what the family dynamics, Cancer, are about, I've reached this point where I think I may have missed something along the way that I need to reinvestigate. So I'm going to go retrograde for a little while. And during that cycle, in true Jupiterian fashion, I'm going to shine a potent light, if you will, upon this family dynamic and see what surfaces. What else is there that needs to be, looked at, considered from Jupiterian? A higher perspective, that's the Sagittarian side, from the Piscean perspective, from a very deep and profound zone of consideration. And we're looking at a trine now between Jupiter in Cancer and, oh yeah, Saturn up there in Pisces, the sign that it has the traditional natural rulership for, as well as Sagittarius. You know, might there be challenges and restrictions? Hey, it's Saturn. Saturn is about, saying there are limitations and restrictions and a container within which you need to do things. Jupiter's like, from that Sagittarian perspective, it's like, don't try and box me in. Don't try and contain me. Can you feel that? Even though it's a trine and they're talking to each other from this watery zone, you know, just a bit of, there might be some hard edges in this mix. And we've already talked about this before, but the Grand Water Trine, which has been in play for a while, which included this Jupiter and Saturn, the sun is coming to participate in that. In just a few days, it will, highlight that third point quite explicitly from the Scorpio perspective and saying, is there something we may have overlooked in what it is that from the family dynamic, that Jupiter reality, and from the spiritual perspective, that Piscean reality that is in the mix now of how we might discover, Scorpio, our shared resources in this consideration. Oh, and just on this same day, you can kind of see that the Mars and the Mercury are less than a degree apart. I didn't say this before, but Mars is the traditional ruler of, you guessed it, Scorpio. So that grand water trine being stimulated with solar energy is getting a, what should we call it, a tailwind? Or maybe a swift kick in the ass? A poke in the butt? Mars is kind of prickly sometimes, saying, from a Sagittarian perspective, dancing with Mercury is like, what else is there? You know, I'm sensing a larger potential picture. Don't hold me back. And at the same time, you can almost feel a a stumbling of fumbling uh, of language to try to facilitate appropriate communication with each other in this larger level of investigation that is being challenged right now. The Grand Water Trine says, from a water perspective, how can we facilitate a unified coming together kind of energy that we're all a part of? And Mars is like, yeah, from Sagittarius, as long as we don't lose track of what the larger picture is. And, you know, and in some level of an attempt, try to find language that, you know, is not going to hold us back from the potential for a larger perspective that's just right there. You're right on that edge between being in the here and the now and taking a next step to something you hadn't thought of yet. And the week proceeds. Look at that. Mars and Mercury just shifted positions. Mars went past Mercury. Mercury, after all, is in retrograde. Think it's looking back and trying to consider, I had this idea that there was something more. I need to look into it more thoroughly. And Mars is, it's charging on because, hey, it's Mars. I got places to go. I got a larger perspective that is drawing me to, facilitate something. I don't know what it is yet. We'll get into the the Mercury retrograde a little bit more because it's going to go back into Scorpio. It wasn't done with that deep, mystical, secretive realm of Scorpio. That realm where, the vitality of our shared resources are going to be allowed to, discover something quite dynamic that couldn't happen any other way, but are engaging quite intimately with one another. Let's see, let's bounce the week ahead. We get to Sunday, there's our Mars. Our sun up there at 24 degrees Scorpio, right touched strongly into that grand water trine there with two other retrograde planets, Jupiter and Saturn. And the sun doesn't go retrograde. It's our vitality. And so the vitality of really engaging in the Scorpio dance is got to be in the mix. What level of transformation is seeking, to come above the surface, you know, instead of being hidden in the dark recesses of a realm that we don't often go into? We want to investigate that. Research time is a research time. You know, some of the energy that you might be able to apply effectively to that Mercury retrograde cycle. This is the realm of the shaman. From a shamanic perspective, the Scorpio dance is very much attuned to the mysteries, to that secret side of investigation into, what should we call it? Levels, deep within levels of soul perspective that are always in play, yet, you know, in this world that we live in, the human perspective side of the equation doesn't always have that curiosity to recognize that we are much more than just these physical beings. You know, these are just vehicles for our soul development. That's the shamanic perspective. And from that, we grow. Not necessarily easily, because There is an initiation process that we go through multiple times as we discover and rediscover and rediscover what is it that this soul who I am really incarnated into this chaos world to grow effectively and with other soul awareness of things that we need to do now. I'm going to let that suffice. I feel like I probably talked way too long today, but there's so much energy afoot. So I apologize if this was just a little bit more than you'd anticipated sitting down to, but I'm working at a lot of different levels. I always do. And because of that, this day has unfolded to give you pause for cause as we step into this next week. Be adventurous. Be willing to take chances. They won't always work out, but we, you and I, can and will grow from that adventure. So, see you all next week. Ciao.